The rain came sideways that night, not the soft kind that settles over the Appalachian hills, like a whisper, and makes
We
the
leave
old
now.
forest smell
Grab
like
the crate.
pine and
I'm
cold
coming.
water.
Just let me.
This was the hard kind, the kind that finds every crack in every window frame and reminds you that these mountains were here before you arrived and will be here long after you are gone. The kind of rain that makes the trees sound like they are breathing. She had been watching the cottage for 40 minutes. She stood at the tree line with her hood pulled low, reading the building the way she had been trained to read everything. Entrances, sight lines, the quality of light behind the windows, the pattern of movement or absence of movement inside. One lamp on, east-facing room, no shadow crossing it for the past 20 minutes, which meant whoever lived here had either gone to bed or fallen into the kind of deep focus that made people forget to move. The cottage was small, smaller than she had expected for someone who apparently maintained records for the entire county. White clapboard siding gone gray with age. A front porch with 2 steps, one of them visibly soft in the middle. Window boxes beneath the front glass, empty now in late October. The soil dark and carefully turned even in the off-season. Someone who paid attention to small things. Someone who did not let what he had fall into neglect simply because it was modest. She noted the back latch. Old hardware, single bolt construction, the kind installed in an earlier decade and never replaced because nothing had gone wrong with it yet. She could work it open in under 4 seconds with the tool she carried in her left boot. She had not come here to steal. She told herself that. She had come for information, for the one thing she needed more than food or shelter or sleep, which she had been running short on for 3 weeks moving through these hills alone. She had followed a thread so thin it barely qualified as a thread, a name passed between merchants 2 layers deep, a mention of a county records clerk in a town that barely appeared on modern maps, a man who had apparently been asking questions about a missing orc girl for going on 4 years. The name was Cillian Marks. She did not know him. She did not trust him. She had stopped trusting people she did not know somewhere in the first year of searching, and she had stopped trusting most people she did know somewhere in the second. 4 years had made her careful in the way that loss makes people careful. Not timid, but precise. She did not extend what she could not afford to lose. She moved from the tree line in a straight line to the back of the cottage, staying low, staying quiet. The rain covered her footsteps. She reached the back door in 11 seconds. Her hand found the latch. 4 seconds. As expected, she stepped inside. The kitchen was dark. She waited, letting her eyes adjust to the absence of the rain light outside. The layout assembled itself slowly. Sink, stove, short counter, shelves with jars and tins arranged by height. Everything clean. Organized in the deliberate way of someone who had very little and had decided to take careful account of what they had. She could see the pot on the stove, still radiating faint warmth through the iron. A bread knife on the cutting board with crumbs still present. Someone had eaten here tonight. She moved toward the main room. Her boot caught the wooden crate. She had not seen it in the dark. It was sitting 2 feet from the kitchen threshold, half packed with paper files, and when her toe made contact, the sound it produced was not subtle. A hard knock followed by the crate scraping 6 inches across the bare wood floor before she caught it with her foot. She froze. The lamp in the east room did not go out. It shifted. The quality of the light changed in the way light changes when someone picks up the source and carries it. She pressed her back against the wall to the right of the kitchen threshold and put herself into the shadow between the shelves. Her right hand went to the utility blade at her belt. Not a weapon by design, more tool than combat instrument, and she held it loosely and waited with the patience she had spent a decade building. The man who appeared in the doorway was not what 3 weeks of imagining had constructed. She had been building him quietly, without fully realizing she was building him. The record keeper who had been asking questions, she had expected someone older. Someone with the dry, watchful look of a bureaucrat who had stumbled onto something he half regretted. Someone who would look at her and start calculating. This man was maybe 30. Lean in the way that people are lean when their work keeps them at a desk and meals become incidental. Brown hair that showed the ghost of a morning's effort at arrangement and had since returned to its own inclinations. He was holding a candle in one hand and nothing in the other, and he wore the kind of worn flannel shirt that people wear when they have stopped preparing for visitors. He looked at her. He did not shout. He did not step back. He did not reach for anything. He looked at her the way a person looks at a problem they are trying to understand rather than flee, steady and mildly puzzled, as though her presence in his kitchen at 2 in the morning was unusual, but not beyond the range of things he was prepared to think about. His eyes moved to the blade in her hand, then to her face, then downward. She followed his gaze. The blood was on the floor. She had not felt it. She had a habit, built through years of training and then through years of having no alternative but to push past discomfort, of not registering pain until a situation resolved. Her right hand was bleeding through the cloth she had wrapped around it sometime in the past hour without fully registering why. The crate had torn open a cut she had taken 3 days back on a ridge road, a wound she had cleaned and told herself was manageable. The bandage had loosened. The crate's corner had found the cut. The blood was not dramatic, but it was real, and it was on his clean floor. She looked up. He set the candle on the writing desk she could now see behind him, stacked with documents, a pen resting in its holder, and turned and disappeared into the darkness of the east room. He came back carrying a tin box. He crossed the room without hurrying and crouched on the floor at a careful distance from her. Not crowding, not performing distance either, just calibrating correctly, and opened the tin. Inside, needles, thread, clean linen strips, a small jar that smelled, even from where she stood, like yarrow and something sweet. He held the tin toward her. He said he was not going to call anyone. He said she was bleeding enough to need stitches, and he knew how to do it. He said she could refuse and he would not force the matter, but he would genuinely prefer she not bleed to death on his floor. Not because of the mess, he said, but because he would feel guilty about it for the rest of his life. Then he waited. She stood against the wall and looked at him, crouching there with his first aid tin and his candle and his complete absence of urgency, and she ran the assessment she had been running on people for a decade. Was this calculation? Was there an audience? Was there something he wanted that this performance was designed to obtain? Nothing. No audience. No calculation that she could find. Just a man who had decided this was the correct thing to do and saw no reason to make it complicated. She unwrapped her hand. He worked without commentary. He heated water in the pot by the stove without being asked and without making it a statement. He cleaned the cut carefully, applied the salve from the small jar, and stitched the edges together with small, practiced strokes. His hands did not shake. They were not surgeon's hands, not the trained precision of medicine, but the hands of someone who had learned a skill and repeated it often enough that the motions had become quiet and sure. He worked, and she watched his face, and his face told her that he was concentrating, and that whatever fear he might be holding was placed somewhere he had decided not to let it run things. She asked him after a while why he was not frightened. He said he was a little, but that she was hurt, and that seemed like the more pressing issue. She looked at him. He said it the way someone states a practical fact, not performing bravery, not seeking credit for the observation, just saying the true thing. He finished the stitching and bandaged the hand in clean cloth, tied it neatly, and sat back on his heels. He asked if she was hungry. She said she did not need charity. He said it was not charity. It was yesterday's soup and bread, and he was making it anyway because he was hungry, and she was welcome to some if she wanted. A silence. She said with the formal register she could not entirely stop herself from defaulting to, that she would accept a small amount. He stood up and went to the kitchen. While his back was turned, she heard the soup pot settle on the burner and the sound of bread being cut, and she moved away from the wall, because standing with her back against a wall was a defensive posture, and she was not going to maintain a defensive posture in a room with a man who had just sutured her hand without conditions. She turned toward the east room, and she saw the wall. She had known, following this thread for 3 weeks, that there would be something here. A file, a folder, the residue of an investigation. She had prepared herself for paperwork, for the bureaucratic language of a case number and a status update, and the dry official register of someone who had looked into something and filed what they found. She had not prepared for this. The wall across from the writing desk had been transformed into something that was not a wall anymore. It was an archive assembled over time with the patience that only years produce. Not chaotic, nothing about this room was chaotic, but dense with accumulated information. Photographs, hand-drawn sketches, Maps with locations circled in red ink, dates written in a small, precise hand beside each marker, notes pinned in careful rows, some of them yellowing at the edges, some clearly recent. A length of red string running from a location in West Virginia, southward through Virginia, and then further south into North Carolina and Tennessee. At the center of the wall, pinned at its upper corner, was a photograph. A young orc girl, maybe 15 or 16 when it was taken, caught in the middle of a laugh at something the camera could not see. Already broad across the shoulders at that age, dark amber eyes bright with whatever the joke was. A blue glass bracelet on her left wrist catching the light. Dara Stone had not cried in 4 years. She did not cry now. But something in her chest, something that had been clenched like a fist since the morning her advisors had brought her the news of the raid, shifted in a way she had not authorized and could not immediately control. It was the laugh. The photograph had caught it exactly as it was in life. The quality that had always been Ren's specific signature. The way she laughed like the world was offering jokes that most people were too serious to hear. The laugh that found what everyone else missed. She had forgotten, somewhere in 4 years of searching, what her sister's laugh looked like. Here it was, pinned to the wall of a stranger's cottage in the rain, in a town that barely existed on modern maps. She heard him behind her and did not turn around. He set a bowl of soup and bread on the desk beside her and stepped back. She heard him settle at the kitchen table. He said nothing about the wall. She stood and looked at it. The map, the circled locations, the progression of dates. She read the timeline of investigation the way she had been trained to read territorial maps, looking for the logic beneath the surface, the shape of the search underneath the individual data points. 3 locations in the first year. A gap in the second year that was not, she could see from the density of adjacent notes, an absence of effort. It was a period when the trail had gone cold and he had kept working the edges, writing letters, following contacts, building outward from what he knew, rather than stopping at the boundary of what he'd already found. A photograph she had never seen before, pinned in the lower left corner, not of Ren. A road junction, hand-sketched in pencil and detailed enough to navigate by. Beside it, a note in that small handwriting. Route 58 Junction, witness account, year 2. Subject moving south on foot, late afternoon. Refused a ride, moving with purpose, moving with purpose. Ren had been alive in year 2, moving with intention, going somewhere. Dara pressed her knuckles to her mouth briefly, a stone-marked gesture that belonged to moments of feeling too large for ordinary expression. She lowered her hand before she had fully processed the impulse. She turned around. He was at the kitchen table with tea, reading something that had nothing to do with the wall, and he looked up when she turned without making anything significant of the 12 minutes she had been standing there. She sat down across from him. She picked up the soup. She ate in silence. He drank his tea and read his papers and did not require anything of her. She could not remember the last time someone had given her space to exist in a room without needing her to perform or explain or lead something. She was always being needed. It had been years since someone had simply let her be present without purpose. When she finished the soup, she asked where she could sleep. He stood without hesitation and led her to the bedroom at the back of the cottage. Narrow bed, thin blanket, a window with the crack sealed with something that smelled like pine resin. She started to say this was his room, and he said she had stitches in her hand and needed to be off the floor, and he would take the hearth. He said it with no drama and no request for acknowledgement. She lay down on the narrow mattress and pulled the blanket over herself and stared at the ceiling while the rain moved through the forest outside and the cottage creaked in the low particular voice of old buildings that know their own joints. She listened to his breathing steady across the room. She had not slept under a roof with another person in 3 weeks. She had told herself she preferred the solitude. She had been telling herself a version of that for years, that the aloneness of leadership was simply the condition of the position, and that she had made her peace with it. Her advisors were always near. Her guards were always close. She was never physically alone. She had been alone for a very long time. This was different in a way she could not yet name. She closed her eyes and the difference settled over her like warmth. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately count, she did not dream of anything terrible. He was awake before her. She heard him through the wall. Careful movement in the early morning. The quiet calibration of someone who had lived alone long enough to stop making unnecessary sound. The soft clank of a pot. The particular hiss of a burner catching. Something herbed being heated. She had meant to be gone before he woke. She had made the decision in the gray hour before dawn, in the brief window of clarity between sleep and waking. Take what she could have from the wall. Be on the road south before daylight made the situation complicated. She pushed herself upright. Her hand addressed her immediately with a comprehensive objection. The stitches held. That was not the problem. The problem was the palm, the wrist, the forearm muscle that connected to the cut, all of which had apparently spent the night compiling grievances they now presented at once. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed through it with the steadiness her trainer had drilled into her at 14 for exactly this kind of situation. The breathing was less effective than usual. He appeared in the doorway with tea. He looked at her, sitting on the edge of the bed with her jaw set and her expression doing the calculation of whether to admit she was in pain, and he set the tea on the floor beside her without commentary. He said the road south ran rough in this kind of wet weather, and her stitches needed at least 2 days before she put that hand under real strain. He said it the way he might report a fact about road conditions. Then he went back to the kitchen, and she heard oats and dried fruit being assembled into something that smelled better than it had any right to. She picked up the tea. It was very good. Some combination of dried herbs she could not immediately identify, faintly sweet, warming in a way that reached the back of her shoulders. She sat with the cup and watched the pale October light come slow through the wax paper window and made the decision not to decide anything until she felt less like a cloth that had been wrung and left to dry. This was how the first full day began. She spent most of the morning at the wall. He worked at his desk. He had actual work, county documents, land records, correspondence that required transcription. And he did this with the concentrated focus of someone for whom attention was not an effort, but a default. He did not check whether she was watching him. He did not narrate his work or fill the silence with the kind of commentary people use to signal their value. He simply worked, pen moving in the small, precise hand she recognized from the wall's notes, pausing occasionally to consult a reference volume. She read the wall the way she would read intelligence gathered from contested territory. Everything here was sourced. Every note carried a date, a location, a record of origin, a traveling merchant's account, a letter from a county clerk 2 districts away, a public record she had never known to look for. The cross-referencing was methodical, not obsession. Nothing here had the breathless quality of obsession. This was something more disciplined, the work of someone who understood how information behaved over time, how it degraded, how it could be triangulated from multiple weaker sources into something reliable. He was better at this than her trackers. Her trackers were the finest the Stonemark clan had deployed in a generation, trained in human territories, fluent in the relevant systems, resourced, connected, officially sanctioned. She had given them 4 years in everything the clan could provide. This man, with a county record salary and a tin of salt in a cottage with a cracked window, had assembled more specific, more carefully sourced, more actionable information about her sister's movements than they had gathered in twice the time. She stood at the wall for a long time thinking about what that said about the search, and what it said about her, and what it might say about why the trail had gone cold in ways it should not have. In the afternoon, she asked him how. He looked up from his desk. He said he was a record keeper, that it was his job to know where information lived and how to reach it, that he had been reaching for this particular thread for a long time. She asked why. He set his pen down. He said that 4 years ago, someone had handed him a file that nobody in the office wanted because nobody believed it was worth the effort. He said he had opened it, expecting a routine matter, and found instead a photograph of a girl mid-laugh, a description of a blue glass bracelet she never removed, and a note from a family asking only that someone find out if she was alive. He said the case had been officially closed 8 months later, ruled unresolvable. He said he had taken the file home. He said he had kept looking because stopping had felt to him like choosing to agree that she did not matter. And he could not make himself choose that. He said it plainly, without reaching for effect, the way someone states the actual reason rather than the version of the reason that sounds better. She stood at the wall and looked at her sister laughing in the photograph and felt something move through her chest that she did not have the right language for. She said carefully that the girl in the photograph laughed like that all the time, like the world was offering something funnier than most people were paying attention to. He said he had noticed that in the photograph, that it had been the first thing he saw in it. They were quiet after that, but it was a different quiet than before. Something had been placed between them in that exchange. Something small and warm and specific, and it remained when the silence resumed. On the second evening, after the light went from the window and the desk lamp became the main illumination in the cottage, she sat in the chair by the hearth and opened the files he had left on the side table. Most confirmed what the wall showed: sourced accounts, cross-referenced dates, the careful reconstruction of a trail from its edges. Then she found the folder. It was at the bottom of the stack, slightly thicker than the others. Its tab labeled Physical Evidence, Year 1 Recovery. Inside, a photograph of an object on a salvage yard intake table. Blue glass, a bracelet broken at the clasp, its beads faintly dulled with road dust. She recognized it before her mind finished the sentence. Wren had worn that bracelet every day of her life from the age of 7, a gift from their mother made by a glass worker in the Eastern Settlement. Individual beads in a shade of pale blue their mother had chosen because she said it was the color of clear water. And Wren had always loved rivers. Wren wore it to formal clan meetings and weapons training and to bed. She had been wearing it in the photograph on the wall. She never took it off. Dara read the documentation behind the photograph. Recovered from a salvage yard outside Waynesboro, Virginia. Date of recovery, 8 months after the raid. The yard's intake log had recorded it as part of a collection of road-found items turned in by a highway contractor clearing Route 340 southbound. The contractor's log, obtained by Cillian through a regional public records request she had not known existed, noted the items had been collected from a 2-mile stretch of cleared road. 8 months after the raid. Waynesboro, Virginia, 240 miles south of where the attack had occurred. The Stonemark clan's official search had been called off 6 months after the raid. Their trackers had reported the trail cold in southern West Virginia. They had never reached Virginia. They had determined with professional certainty she had at the time accepted that the absence of a trail meant the trail was not there. Wren had been alive and moving south for at least 8 months. The clan had stopped looking while her sister was still walking. Dara set the photograph down on the side table. She sat very still and let that arrive the way she had trained herself to receive difficult information, without flinching, absorbing the weight of it, deciding what to do rather than simply reacting. He was at his desk. She could hear the pen moving. She said nothing for a long time. She found the second thing an hour later. At the very back of the evidence folder, folded once and slipped behind the documentation, was a single sheet on heavier correspondence paper, slightly aged at the fold. She opened it, a photocopy of an original made on an older machine that reproduced texture as well as content. The original had been handwritten. She knew the handwriting before she read a single word. She had seen it on birthday cards and training logs, and the long, complicated notes Wren used to leave on the kitchen table of the stronghold when she had something to say and thought no one was sitting still enough to listen. The particular slant of it, slightly rightward, the letters slightly compressed, the distinctive small loop on the lowercase low. The letter was addressed to the Stonemark Clan office, Rural Route, West Virginia. The date at the top, 3 years ago. It began, "I don't know if this will reach you. I've tried before. I'm trying again." Not long, half a page, Wren describing where she was. Not a specific address, but a region. A river crossing she named, a trading route she was following. Saying she was alive and unhurt. Saying she had tried to come home twice and been told each time by people claiming to speak for the clan that she was not wanted. Saying she did not know if that was true, but that she was writing because the alternative was to accept it completely, and she was not ready to accept it completely. She said, "If anyone is still looking, I am here. I am trying to find a way home. I haven't stopped." At the bottom of the page, a note in Cillian's handwriting. Original recovered from Harrow Creek Postal Archive, unclaimed/undelivered bin, year 3. No record of delivery confirmation to Stonemark address. No record of rejection and return. Letter appears to have been received in the system and not forwarded. Not returned, not lost in transit. received somewhere in the chain between the postal archive and the Stonemark clan office, and stopped there. Someone had removed this letter from the mail stream and ensured it never arrived. Dara folded the letter and placed it back precisely where she had found it. She sat in the chair by the hearth for a long time after, while the rain slowed outside and the old forest settled into the quiet that comes after weather. And the lamp on his desk threw its circle of light over the wall, and the photograph of Wren glowed at its center. He had found this 3 years ago. He had kept looking after finding it. He had kept looking after finding evidence that someone in the chain had deliberately stopped a letter from its destination. He had kept going without resources, without official standing, in a town that barely registered on state maps, with ink on his hands and no family to come home to, and a tin of honey on his kitchen shelf that he apparently allowed himself one spoonful of on Sundays. She did not know this man. She had been in his house for less than 24 hours. She had broken his latch, bled on his floor, eaten his food, slept in his bed, and gone through 4 years of his private files. But she recognized what it looked like to keep going when stopping was easier. She had been doing it herself, and she had never met another person who was doing the same thing. Not for her sister, not from the outside, not without being asked. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely. She sat and watched him work and thought about the letter in the folder, and about what it meant that someone had stopped it, and about how much she needed to understand who that person was before she moved in any direction. She did not sleep for the rest of that night, but for the first time in 4 years, she did not feel the full weight of it entirely alone. And that, she told herself, was enough to sit with for now. First, she had to figure out how much she could trust the man who had found it. She did not leave on the third day. She had made the decision twice. Once before dawn, when the room was dark and the road south was theoretically waiting. Once in the gray afternoon when the rain had stopped briefly, and she had stood at the window looking at the empty lane and told herself to move. Both times the decision had arrived and then quietly dissolved before she had acted on it. She told herself it was the hand. The stitches were holding, but the swelling had not resolved the way it should have. And the faint heat in the skin round the cut told her that Cillian's concern about infection had not been unfounded. 2 days, he had said, before she put real strain on it. She had pushed through worse and she knew it. She also knew the difference between pushing through something manageable and turning something manageable into a problem that cost weeks. She had learned that distinction in her mid-20s during a border patrol that had run 3 days too long, from a cut not unlike this one. She was being practical. She told herself that. She mostly believed it. The third morning, she woke to coffee and something frying in the cast iron, and she lay in the narrow bed for a moment listening to the particular sound of him in the kitchen. That careful quiet she had already started recognizing. The deliberate economy of someone who had lived alone long enough to stop making noise for its own sake. And noticed, without immediately knowing what to do with the noticing, that something in her had stopped bracing for what came next. She got up and went to the kitchen. They did not talk much in the mornings. This suited her. She had spent a decade in rooms where silence was treated as a problem requiring solution, where advisors filled every available pause with commentary and the anxious verbosity of people who equated being heard with being useful. She had learned to find silence suspicious, to wait for what was inside it. His silence had nothing inside it except the morning. He made coffee in a battered percolator and poured 2 cups without asking, and set one at her end of the table and returned to his work. He ate his breakfast with the focused efficiency of someone treating fuel as fuel rather than occasion. He did not narrate his plans or ask for hers. By the third morning, she had stopped waiting for the catch. He was, as near as she could assess, exactly what he appeared to be. A man who worked carefully with what he had, who took other people's problems seriously without requiring acknowledgement for doing so, who held in everything he did a consistent belief that ordinary decency was not a virtue to be praised but a floor, the minimum owed to the world simply for being in it. She had met very few people who actually lived that way. Most people who claimed the belief performed it selectively. He seemed not to notice that it could be performed, which was the rarest version of it she had encountered. She found it, in a way she had not anticipated, almost disorienting, like walking into a room built without hidden compartments. On the fourth day, she asked him again. Not why he had started, she had that answer, but how he had kept going for 4 years without certainty, without support, with no indication that any of it was leading anywhere at all. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said there had been a period in the second year when he had nearly stopped. He had been following a lead that went nowhere, writing letters that were not answered, and he had sat at his desk one evening looking at the wall and thought clearly and specifically about what it would mean to take everything down, to close the file. He said he had looked at the photograph for a long time that night. He said, the people who loved her were still out there, still not knowing. I couldn't make myself be one more person who decided she wasn't worth the effort. He said it without looking up from the desk. The pen started moving again. She looked at the wall. She said quietly that the people who loved her had not stopped either. He said he knew that. He said that was part of what had kept him going. The certainty that somewhere someone who loved her was still looking, and that if he could find enough of the trail, he might be able to give them something real to work with. She did not tell him yet who she was, but something in that exchange moved through her like water finding a hairline crack. Quiet, gradual, impossible to stop once it had started. The routine built itself without either of them deciding to build it. He worked at the desk in the mornings. She read through the files or sat at the window, tracking the slow October light across the hills and the movement of occasional traffic on the lane below. In the afternoons, he sometimes walked into the village for work that required his physical presence. The mill's inventory records, letters to be delivered in person, and she stayed in the cottage and went through the wall the way she would process intelligence, looking for connections that weren't immediately visible. She found several. The witness account from year 2, the road junction, the note about Wren moving with purpose, placed her 40 miles south of the bracelet recovery location. Consistent direction. Wren had been following Route 340 south. If she had maintained that bearing, the next logical stop was Boone, North Carolina. The trading routes through Boone connected east toward the coast and south into Tennessee. She drew this analysis on a piece of paper and left it on the desk. When he came back from the village and saw it, he stood at the desk for a moment reading it. Then he opened a drawer and took out a folder she had not seen before. He placed it on top of her drawing. Inside, a postal receipt, filed under a case number from his cross-referencing system. The receipt documented a shipment from a post office in Boone, North Carolina, 2 years ago. The sender's name, W. Stone. The destination, the Stone Mark clan's main office, Rural Route, West Virginia. No delivery confirmation, no return notice. The package had been sent. There was no record of it arriving. Wren had been in Boone 2 years ago. Wren had sent a package home, and the package, like the letter before it, had disappeared somewhere between sender and recipient. Not once, not a clerical error. Twice. Deliberate interference by someone with access to the incoming mail chain. She set the receipt on the table and walked to the window and stood looking out at the tree line without seeing it, running the implications through the part of her mind built for threat assessment. Access to the Stonemark clan's communications. Knowledge to look for contact from Wren specifically. The ability to remove items from the mail stream without leaving obvious evidence. That required either official standing within the clan's administrative structure or someone very close to it. Someone embedded enough to monitor, patient enough to intercept over a period of years without drawing attention. She said without turning from the window that this was not a clerical error. He said he had not thought it was a clerical error. He said that was why he had kept the receipt in a separate folder. She turned to look at him. He was standing at the desk with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching her with an openness that had no agenda in it. He looked at her face, and whatever he found there made him say nothing further, which was the right choice, and she noted it. She asked how long he had had the receipt. He said 14 months. 14 months. He had held evidence of deliberate interference for over a year. He had not taken it to official channels. She understood immediately why. Official channels between a human county office and an Orc clan territory were largely theoretical, but he had not stopped either. He had treated it as a one more data point, added it to the picture, and kept building the picture. She looked at the wall. She said, "Who do you think it is?" He said he had a candidate. He said he had been waiting for a second independent source before he named anyone, because naming someone without sufficient grounds was not useful and could be dangerous, and he had set a threshold for himself and had not yet crossed it. She asked what threshold. He said 2 independent sources pointing to the same name. She stood at the window looking at him for a long moment. Then she said she might be able to help him cross it. He did not push. He went back to his desk and picked up his pen. Outside, the afternoon light stretched long and amber across the hills, and the old forest at the edge of the property threw shadows that reached almost to the back door of the cottage. And in the distance, a thrush sang its three-note evening phrase. The card game was his idea. He said his friend from the village came on Fridays to play, but was out of town this week and he had gotten used to having something to do with his hands in the evenings. He said if she was interested, he would teach her. She said she was capable of learning a card game. He said most people said that. He dealt. He explained the rules with the same efficiency he applied to everything else. No excess, no condescension, the kind of explanation that trusted the listener to be intelligent enough to follow the logic. She listened and processed and asked two clarifying questions. She won the second hand, she won the third, and the fourth. By the fifth hand, he was looking at his cards with the expression of a man reassessing a situation he had thought he understood, and she found that expression, the genuine recalibration of it, the absence of embarrassment, unexpectedly entertaining. By the sixth hand, he acknowledged freely that she was considerably better at this than him. She laughed. It came out before she had processed the impulse. Not a polite sound, not the controlled acknowledgement of amusement she had spent years deploying in political rooms. A real laugh, sudden and full. The way she used to laugh before 4 years of grief had made laughter feel like a luxury she could not justify. The sound startled her. She looked at his face. He was watching her honestly, not making anything of the moment for his own purposes, just registering it the way he registered everything, directly, without performance. She looked back at their cards. She said without looking up that she used to laugh like that. Before, he said he was glad to hear it again. No decoration on it, no follow-up designed to extend the moment. Just the true statement, placed and left. She shuffled the deck and dealt the next hand, and they played until the lamp oil was getting low and the fire had settled to coals. And by the end of it, something between them had shifted in the quiet, irreversible way that small changes shift large situations. On the fifth morning that she woke soaked through and shaking, she had been managing the fever for 2 days, running hot, sleeping poorly, refusing to acknowledge what her body was doing. Sometime in the night, the fever had stopped, waiting for her acknowledgement, and arrived in full. She sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the mattress, and did the breathing exercise her trainer had taught her at 14. The breathing exercise was not cooperating. He appeared in the doorway. He took one look and was gone, and came back in under 2 minutes with a cup of something medicinal and sharp-smelling, a cloth soaked in cold water, and an expression on his face that was firm enough that she did not attempt to argue with it. He helped her lie back down and arranged the cold cloth on her forehead and set the cup within reach and settled into the chair he had pulled to the bedside with the patient quality of someone who had made a decision about what was needed and intended to see it through. She lay still and stared at the ceiling. She was surrounded in her ordinary life by people who served her. That was not this. The advisors and guards and petitioners who filled her daily existence were there because of her position, her bloodline, her future, what she represented. Their attention was always conditional underneath its surface, contingent on what she was rather than on the fact of her being a person who was present and needed something. He had no knowledge of what she was. He was sitting with her because she was a person who was sick in his house, and that was the complete extent of his reasoning. He changed the cloth when it warmed, refilled the cup when she drained it, talked to her when she was alert enough to listen. Not about anything requiring response, just the steady, low voice of someone who understood that what a sick person needed was not information, but the sound of another human being choosing to remain near them. He told her small stories about the village, the ongoing property line dispute between neighboring farms that had been active since 1987 and showed every sign of outlasting everyone involved. The time he had mailed an urgent letter to entirely the wrong county magistrate and spent 2 weeks waiting for consequences that never materialized. The miller's cat, which had opinions about record-keeping hours. His voice was low and unhurried. She listened and drifted and came back and listened again. In the fever's worst hours, when the boundary between sleep and waking was unclear, she found herself thinking about her mother. Not the grief version, the stone she carried. The earlier version, The one who had sat at the edge of her bed when she was small and sick and talked in exactly this quality of voice, not trying to fix the illness or argue with it, just staying close. She had not let herself think about her mother that way in years. She surfaced in the late afternoon, clear-headed for the first time since morning, and lay still for a moment before he noticed she was awake. He was at the desk. The lamp was lit. The last of the October light was doing something amber and quiet over the hills, and he was bent over a document with his pen moving. And the room held only the sounds of that and the fire and the trees. She watched him for a moment. She was in trouble, she thought. Not the immediate kind she was practiced at navigating. The slower kind. The kind that did not make an announcement, that arrived quietly and had already made significant progress before you understood what was happening. She had come here for information. She was leaving with information. Those facts had not changed, but she had not been prepared for him. She had built no version of this man in her imagination that resembled what he actually was. She had been prepared for useful. She had not been prepared for the specific relief of his company, the way his plainness felt like cool water after years of rooms full of people calculating the angles, the way his presence made the weight of what she was carrying feel, for the first time in 4 years, like something shared rather than something solely hers. She looked away from him toward the window. First Wren, everything else could wait. On the 6th evening, the situation accelerated all at once. She was at the window when she heard them. Not saw, heard, because orc hearing was sharper than human hearing for the rhythm of organized movement. The cadence of multiple people moving with military coordination rather than the loose irregularity of ordinary travelers. 3 sets of boots, moving along the east lane with the purposeful stride of people who had a destination and had decided in advance how they intended to arrive at it. She was at the door of the main room before she had fully processed moving. He had come from the kitchen when he heard her. He looked at her, then at the window, then back at her face. She said, "They're coming here." Through the glass she could see them now. 3 figures in the amber evening light moving along the east lane. Stonemark colors, dark green and gray, unmistakable at twice the distance. Sergeant Marsh in front, the 2 junior guards behind him. Someone had tracked her movements more efficiently than she had allowed for. He looked at the 3 large armored figures moving toward his door with the stride of people who were not planning to knock and wait politely. He asked calmly if she knew them. She said yes. He asked if they were dangerous to her. She paused. Marsh was not dangerous to her in the way that word usually meant. He was loyal and had been loyal for 15 years and was here because someone with authority over him had sent him, not because he wished her harm. What Marsh represented in this moment was a specific and consequential problem. If she was found here now, before she had the southern lead confirmed, before she had Wren, she would be brought home. The lead would be abandoned, Wren would remain an unfound, everything on this wall would sit here with no one to receive it. He must have read enough of this in her face, because he was already moving. He told her the storage room had a heavy bolt. He told her the east wall had a foundation gap that passed sound through clearly. She could hear without being seen. He told her his cottage was a record-keeper's cottage, and the only things in it worth protecting were the papers, and nobody was getting to the papers without going through him. He said all of it with the same direct calm he brought to everything, as though sheltering a fugitive orc from an official search party on a Wednesday evening in October was simply a problem with a practical solution. She looked at him. She said, "You don't even know who I am." He said, "No, but I know you're not finished looking for your sister. I think that matters more than whoever's at the door." The knock came, 3 solid impacts against the front, not a question. She went to the storage room. He bolted the door gently behind her and went to answer. She pressed her back against the cold stone wall and found the gap at the foundation and listened. He was good. She registered this immediately and gave him full credit for it. He spoke to the guards with the slightly flustered courtesy of a man interrupted in his work, apologizing for the delay in answering, asking what he could do for them. His voice carried nothing that sounded like concealment. He was not performing an innocence. He was simply being the thing he actually was, which was a private citizen whose evening had been interrupted, and that was sufficient because it was true. Marsh provided a description of the woman he was looking for. Accurate, specific. Cillian said he had seen several orc travelers pass through the area recently, the road being a common trade route. He asked if there was additional detail that might help narrow it down. Marsh provided more. Cillian said that no one matching that specific description had come to his home, which was technically true. She had not come to his home. She had broken into it. A pause, she held still in the dark and breathed carefully and trusted that his plainness was adequate cover. A man concealing something looked different from a man telling the precise truth and nothing more. He looked like the second because he was the second. Marsh asked to look around. Cillian said pleasantly and without a beat of hesitation that he could not without a search warrant from the county magistrate's office, standard procedure under West Virginia Residential Property Code, and he was sure the sergeant understood. He said it with the easy authority of someone who had been writing legal documents for 6 years and knew precisely what the law permitted and how to invoke it without making it sound like an accusation. After a moment, Marsh thanked him and moved on. She listened to the footsteps fade down the lane. She stood in the dark storage room for a long moment. Her heart was beating hard, not from fear exactly, but from the complicated physical sensation of having been protected by someone who owed her nothing and had done it anyway, with nothing available to him but a knowledge of property law and a voice that did not waver. He unbolted the storage room door. Light from the main room fell across her face. He stepped back to give her room without making a presentation of it. She stepped out. She looked at him, standing in the lamplight of his small, careful cottage, ink on his left hand, the worn flannel shirt, the steadiness in his face that had been consistent since the first night when he had found her bleeding and decided without deliberation that what the situation called for was bandages. She said, "You should know who I am." He went still. He waited. She told him her name, her true name, her father's name, War Chief Cas Orant of the Stonemark clan, her title, what she was training to become, and what the Stonemark clan was and had been for 300 years in the Appalachian Territory, the largest orc clan east of the Mississippi, its governance structure, the weight of the succession question that had been hovering over her family for 2 years since her father's health had begun to slip. She told him the full truth plainly, the way she would have told a council member, the facts, the weight of them, the implications of what she had done by coming here alone without authorization or escort. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the cottage was quiet. He looked at the wall, at the photograph at its center, at the notes he had written. He looked back at her. He said, "The eldest daughter, the one training for clan leadership." She said, "Yes." He said, "And you've been here in my house for 6 days eating my soup and winning at cards." She said, "Yes." She said she was sorry for not telling him sooner. She said she had not been certain she could trust him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said simply, without decoration, "You can." He turned to the wall and began taking down the southern lead, the postal receipt, the map notation, the merchant's name and location. He laid everything on the table for her. She sat down and looked at the papers. She said, "You're not frightened." He said he was a little. She said, "You don't show it." He said he had spent a long time getting used to being somewhat frightened and doing the necessary thing anyway. She looked at him across the table and thought about the letter in the folder and the package that had never arrived and the deliberate patient work of someone inside her clan who had spent 3 years ensuring Ren stayed lost. She said, "I need to tell you something about what I found in the files." He set down what he was holding and gave her his full attention. She told him about the letter, the receipt from Boone, the pattern she had identified, the access required, the consistency of the interference over 3 years, what it implied about who could be responsible. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he sat for a moment with the stillness of someone reorganizing a large structure around new information. He said, "I have a candidate." She said, "So do I." He said, "Tell me yours." She said, "Aldrich Vane." He opened a drawer. He took out a folder she had not seen. He placed it on the table and opened it. Inside, a partial record. Incomplete by his own threshold, one source, not two, but a purchase record for a private courier service, dated 14 months ago, charged to an account connected to a name she recognized as one of Aldrich Vane's established associates. The courier's delivery route passed directly through the postal sorting facility that handled incoming mail for the Stonemark clan office. Not proof, not sufficient for a formal accusation, but two independent lines of evidence from two people who had arrived at this name separately, converging on the same point. She said, "That's your second source." He said, "Yes." Outside, the night had come fully down over Harrow Creek. The old forest was dark at the property's edge. The lamp threw its light across the table where the evidence was spread between them. She thought about Aldrich Vane, thought about what he had to gain from keeping Wren lost and Dara searching, distracted from the political consolidation that would make her position unassailable, worn down by 4 years of grief and road and the specific exhaustion of looking for something that never came. If Wren returned, Dara's authority in the clan strengthened considerably. If Dara was occupied searching for Wren, the space around the succession question remained open. The calculation was ugly and precise. She said quietly, "After we find her, I'm going to need everything you have on him." He said, "It's already yours." She looked at the papers. She looked at him across the table, ink-stained and unremarkable and honest in the particular way that very few people manage to be honest. Not performing it, not even fully aware of it, just constitutionally incapable of being otherwise. They had work to do, and they returned to it. But that night, after they had gone through everything on the table twice, and the lamp was burning low and the fire had reduced to coals, she found she could not sleep. She lay in his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and let herself be honest about what was true, in the way she was only ever honest with herself in the deepest hours of the night when there was no audience and no position to maintain. She had not been prepared for Cillian Marks. She had been prepared for useful. She had not been prepared for this. The absence of calculation, the quality of his company, the specific way his plainness had become. Over 8 days, something she had started to count on. She had not been prepared to find, in a cottage at the edge of a town that barely existed, a person who made her feel less alone in the carrying of something she had been carrying entirely alone for 4 years. She turned toward the window and told herself, first Wren. Everything else could wait. She had almost found her way towards something like sleep when she heard the knock at the back door. Soft, 3 taps, deliberate, not Cillian. Ian, his breathing was even across the room. She was up before the sound finished. She went to the back door and opened it. Marsh stood in the dark outside, not in full armor, his face carrying the expression of a man who had decided to do something he was not sure was his place to do, and had done it anyway because he had decided it was necessary. He did not come inside. He stood in the doorway in the cold night air and said what he had come to say in the voice of a man who had served a family for 15 years and understood that sometimes loyalty meant saying the things people did not want to hear. He said that Aldrich Vane and the people behind him had been waiting, not for anything specific, just for a reason. Any reason that could be used to raise questions about the legitimacy of her succession before the Elder Council. A future clan leader who had left without authorization, traveled alone through human territories for weeks, and returned with a human companion she had apparently been living with. That was the kind of thing that could be shaped into a weapon in the right hands. Aldrich had the right hands and had been sharpening them for 2 years. He said, "I'm not telling you what to do. That's not my place and it's not my right. I'm telling you what exists so that you can decide with full information, because you deserve that." He said, "I've watched you carry things alone your whole life, since you were old enough to understand what the position meant. I thought you should know what this one might cost." Then he said goodnight and walked back down the east lane and disappeared into the dark. She stood in the open back door of the cottage for a long time. The night was cold and still. The old forest was dark at the property's edge. Inside, she could hear the even sound of Cillian's breathing from across the room. She had spent 10 years making decisions in rooms full of competing pressures and incomplete information. She had buried her mother and taken on twice the responsibility within the same month because the clan had needed her to. She had negotiated trade agreements in rivers up to her waist because the other party had refused to meet on dry land. She had held the succession question at arm's length for 2 years while managing a father's declining health and a council that watched her every decision for evidence of weakness. She had never once stood in the dark not knowing which way to turn. She stood in the dark now and did not know. Not because she was afraid of Aldrich Vane or what he might do. She had faced more dangerous things than a warrior's political ambition. But because for the first time in 4 years, there was something she wanted to hold on to that existed in direct tension with everything she had spent her whole life building. And she did not know what it meant that she wanted to hold on to it. And she did not know what she would do when the search was over and the crisis was resolved and the reason for being here was gone. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she closed the door and went back inside. Cillian's breathing was still even. He had not woken. She sat down at the kitchen table in the dark and sat with the question that had no clear answer and let herself feel the full weight of it. The fear that was not quite fear, the wanting that was not quite allowed, the specific complicated thing it was to be a woman in her position who had spent 4 years looking for her sister and had found, by accident and in the dark, someone she had not expected to find. She sat with it until the lamp in the east room went dark, which meant he had finished his late work and gone to sleep. She was still at the kitchen table when the first gray light came through the window. In the morning, when he appeared with tea and asked if she was ready to go south, she looked at his face, open, unhurried, asking nothing beyond the practical question, and said yes. She would deal with the rest of it when they found Ren. First Ren, everything else could wait. They left on the 8th morning. The decision had settled into certainty sometime in the night, and by the time the gray October dawn came through the cottage's waxed paper windows, they were already moving. Dara packed, Cillian packed in 20 minutes with the compact efficiency of someone who had been living lightly for long enough that it required no deliberation. Before they reached the road, Marsh and the 2 junior guards appeared at the east lane. She had sent word through a whistle code from her childhood, 3 notes in a specific sequence known only to Stonemark clan members, carried in the training like a language within a language. Marsh arrived within the hour, and he stood in the pale morning light with the contained expression of a man professionally relieved that she was alive and professionally uncertain about everything that came after. He looked at Cillian. Cillian looked back at him with the expression she had learned to read as his baseline under mild pressure. Slightly apprehensive, entirely present, not performing anything in either direction. She told Marsh in terms that admitted no negotiation that she was not returning yet, that she had a lead to follow south and intended to follow it, that Cillian Marks was traveling under her personal protection, and anyone with objections to that arrangement could register them with the road and keep walking. Marsh was quiet for a moment. He assessed Cillian the way a man assesses something he has been asked to accept without full context. Thorough, professional, arriving at whatever conclusion he arrived at without expressing it. Then he said they should move before the weather turned. They moved south as the sun came up over the Appalachian ridgeline and painted the old forest amber in the way that October light does when it has decided to be beautiful before the cold comes for it fully. The journey took 4 days. She had traveled hard roads before and in worse conditions. What she had not done was travel them with someone who moved the way Cillian moved, without complaint, without performance, with the same quiet economy he brought to everything. He was not a trained traveler. She could see that in the small calibrations he made, adjusting his pack on the second morning when his shoulder began pulling, managing the cold by adding layers in a methodical sequence rather than ignoring the problem. He was not hardened to this, but he kept pace without being asked. He managed the terrain without commentary. Without planning to, she found herself adjusting her stride slightly to stay alongside him rather than ahead. Marsh noticed. She knew he noticed because Marsh was excellent at noticing and excellent at the professional discretion of someone who keeps what he notices to himself. On the second evening, while the fire settled into its working height at the road's edge, Marsh sat across from Cillian with the deliberate casualness of someone conducting an assessment that he preferred not to look like an assessment. He asked what Cillian did. Cillian said he kept records. Marsh said he understood that. He asked what he had done before that. Cillian said he had kept different records in a different county, and before that he had been a junior clerk at the regional magistrate's office, and before that he had been the son of 2 people who were no longer living. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Then he asked directly why a magistrate's clerk had spent 4 years looking for a missing orc girl. Cillian looked at the fire for a moment. He said, "Because someone handed me her file and nobody else wanted it, because I looked at the photograph and thought that was the wrong reason for a person to be unfound." Marsh was quiet for a longer moment. Then he poured a second cup of coffee and handed it across the fire to Cillian and did not ask any further questions that evening. She sat on her side of the fire and said nothing, and felt something complicated move through her chest and said nothing about that either. They reached the trading post on the afternoon of the fourth day. The settlement sat at a river crossing in the long valley between two ridges, the kind of place that existed because the geography had required a crossing and commerce had followed the geography. 40 or 50 structures, some permanent, some seasonal. A grain store, a feed supplier, covered market stalls in the final hours of the afternoon day. The kind of place Cillian had told her on the road, where nobody asked more than was necessary and everyone kept to their own business. She let him lead. This required more from her than most things had in a long time. She was a woman who led, not as a role she had chosen, but as a condition so deeply built into her that the distinction had long since stopped on mattering. She led in rooms full of people who had known her since birth and still tested her authority. She led in negotiations with clan representatives who looked for weakness in every pause. She let him lead because this was his territory in the specific professional sense, the tracking of information through human systems. The navigation of a community like this, where trust extended in small increments and the wrong approach could close a door before you knew it was open. He found the merchant within the hour. She watched from a distance while he worked. He was not aggressive about it, not authoritative, not using the kind of official weight that sometimes opened doors and sometimes cemented them shut. He moved through the market like a man looking for something he needed and not in particular hurry, pausing at two stalls for exchanges that looked like small talk and were almost certainly more precise than that. When he found the merchant, a small thin man with a cart of dry goods and the watchful stillness of someone who had been monitoring this road for trouble since before they arrived. She watched Cillian position himself between the man and the view of marsh and the guards. An instinctive courtesy. He understood what three armored figures did to a nervous person's willingness to speak. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. She watched the merchant's face from her distance, reading the progression she had learned in 10 years of negotiation. Wariness, then assessment, then the specific discomfort of someone about to admit to a cowardly choice, and then the telling part, the loosening that came after, the relief of saying the thing. Cillian walked back to her. He said, "She's alive. There's a settlement 2 days east. A family named Hahn took her in about 3 years ago. A woman named Celeste Hahn found her on the road not long after the raid. She was alone and badly frightened, and Celeste took her in. He said it clearly and let her receive it. She stood very still. He said, she's been trying to find a way home. She didn't know if home was still looking for her. The trees at the edge of the settlement shifted in a wind she had not noticed until that moment. She said 2 days east. He said yes. 2 days. After 4 years of searching, after dead ends and cold trails, and the letters that went nowhere and the official declarations that the matter was resolved in the morning they had brought her the news, and she had felt the floor go uncertain beneath her. After all of it, 2 days. She pressed her knuckles to her mouth. He stood beside her and did not speak and did not move away. She could feel the warmth of him in the October cold. He did not reach for her. He did not offer words designed to make the moment something manageable. He simply remained present while she received what she was receiving. After a moment, she straightened. She looked at him. She said, "Let's move." They found Wren on the afternoon of the second day's journey east. The settlement was small, a dozen structures around a central yard grown up around a working farm in the incremental way that places grow when they are useful, and the people in them are decent to each other. Smoke from 2 chimneys. The sound of something being worked in metals from a shed on the far side of the yard. A dog that assessed them from 20 feet and decided they were acceptable. And in the doorway of the largest building, a young orc woman with a cooking cloth over one arm, watching the road. She was taller than in the photograph. 4 years will do that, especially to someone who was still growing at 16. Broader across the shoulders now, standing with the upright quality of someone who had been through difficult things and had come through them still standing. Her eyes were dark amber, exactly like her sister's. The cooking cloth was blue, not the bracelet. That was gone, lost somewhere on Route 344 years back. But the shade of blue their mother had always loved, the color of clear water. Wren carrying it in some form, the way she had always carried it. The procession came down the main track toward the settlement. Stonemark colors, dark green and gray. Wren saw the colors and went still. The cooking cloth stopped moving in her hands. Her face did the thing that faces do when the mind is processing something too large for its immediate systems. A brief suspension of everything, all expression held while the interior machinery caught up. And then she saw Dara. What happened next was not composed. It was not controlled or dignified in any political sense. It was the reunion of two people who had lost each other, slamming back together with the full weight of 4 years, and all that those 4 years had cost. And it happened in the doorway of a farmhouse in eastern Tennessee, while Celeste Hahn watched from the threshold with tears running freely, and Marsh and the two guards found things to look at in the middle distance, and Cillian stood at the edge of the track and felt his chest do something complicated that had no clean name. He had been looking for this girl for 4 years. He had kept her photograph at the center of a wall of notes, written letters into silence and kept writing them, spent Friday evenings adding pins to a map that made most people who saw it uncomfortable. He had done it because stopping had felt like choosing to agree that she did not matter, and he had not been willing to make that choice. He had never expected to see the ending of it. He pressed his knuckles briefly to his mouth and realized what he was doing, had absorbed the gesture from watching Dara contain things too large for ordinary expression, and lowered his hand quietly. Behind him, Marsh made a small sound that might have been something catching in his throat. Eventually, Dara looked back at him across the small yard. Her eyes were dark and fierce and bright in the specific combination that happened when someone was feeling too many things at once for any single expression to hold all of them. She reached out one hand toward him, an invitation, deliberate and unhurried. He crossed the yard and came into her, and she put her hand on his shoulder, heavy and warm and intentional, the weight of it carrying something beyond the physical, and said to her sister in the formal register of Stonemark introduction, "This is Cillian Marks. He has been looking for you since before I knew how to find you." Wren looked at him. Something moved through her face, assessment first, and then the recognition of something she didn't yet have full language for, and then breaking through the surface of the serious moment, the quality of expression that the photograph on his wall had captured 20 years into her life, and that she apparently still carried unchanged. The laugh that found the thing everyone else had missed. She said in a voice warm with it, "I have a feeling I owe you a very good meal." He said he would settle for the soup recipe. Dara looked at him. He looked back at her. The right moment was later. Celeste Hahn fed them all. She was a practical woman with the competence of someone who had built something solid in a difficult place, and she handled the arrival of 5 Orc clan members and 1 human records clerk with the same grounded calm she appeared to bring to most things, directing people toward spaces, producing food in quantities that suggested she had learned long ago to cook for unexpected numbers. They sat at the long table in the main room, and Wren talked, and Dara listened. And the story that came out over the course of that evening was the story the files had pointed toward, but could not have fully told. The raid, the scattering, the weeks of walking south alone and frightened, following the road because the road was the only thing that offered direction. Celeste finding her on the shoulder of Route 19 in the rain, sitting on her pack, and asking with the simple directness of a woman who did not waste motion, "Do you need help?" 3 years in this settlement. 3 years of trying to find her way back. Then Wren said the thing that the evidence had implied, but that hearing spoken aloud was different from reading in documentation. She said she had tried to go home twice. The first time, 2 men had stopped her on the road 2 days north of the settlement. They wore partial Stonemark colors, close enough to read as genuine if you weren't looking carefully. They told her the clan had resolved the matter of her disappearance, that her return was not needed, that her family had moved forward. She had not fully believed it, but she had not been able to entirely disbelieve it either. She was 16, alone, and the men had been very certain about a thing that was entirely possible to believe about a clan that needed its future leader's attention elsewhere. The second time she had written the letter, sent it to the clan office, the address she had known since childhood. 3 months later, it came back with a notation. No such recipient at this address. She had sent a package the following year. It had not been returned, but there had been no response. After that, she had stopped. She said she had told herself it was practical, that she had a life here now, that Celeste had needed her, that the settlement was good and she was not going to spend the rest of her years breaking herself against something that apparently could not be moved. She said she had been lying to herself about the practical part. She said, I believed in the part of myself I didn't look at directly, that my family had decided I was more trouble than I was worth, that you had grown up into your position and needed to focus and had moved on. She looked at Dara. She said, I thought you stopped looking. Dara said, I never stopped. The table was quiet. Then Cillian opened the waterproof folder he had been carrying since they left Harrow Creek. He spread 3 documents on the table: the postal receipt, the copy of the letter, the partial record connecting Aldrich Vane's associate to the courier service on the interception route. He explained each one the way he explained everything: where it had come from, what it confirmed, what it only suggested, what would still be needed for a formal accusation. He did not editorialize. He presented the evidence as evidence. When he finished, the table was quiet for a different reason. Wren looked at the documents for a long moment. She looked at her sister. She said, someone in the clan did this deliberately. Dara said, yes. Wren said, Aldrich Vane. Dara said, we believe so. We don't yet have everything we need to make it hold before the Elder Council. Wren was quiet. She had the expression of someone who had been turning a thought over for a long time and had arrived at the place where it was ready to be said. She said, there was a third man the first time they stopped me on the road, the 2 in the partial stonemark colors, and a third who stayed back and didn't speak. I only saw him clearly for a moment. He was large. There was a scar on his jaw, left side. Long one, pale. Cillian reached into the folder without speaking. He took out a single page, a physical description from a witness account, year 3, from a separate incident he had been cross-referencing because the description had nagged at him for 14 months without a confirmed connection. He placed it on the table. Wren read it. She looked up. She said, that's him. The scar, the jaw, the way he stood with his weight to the right. That's him. The cigar, the height, the specific postural habit. Wren's description and the witness account aligned it in the precise way that reliable independent accounts align, not identical in language, identical in fact. Aldrich Vane had been present at the first interception personally. It was no longer circumstantial. Dara sat back from the table. She had known, in the way you know things when the evidence is still building toward what you already understand at some deeper level, since the second evening in Harrow Creek. She had known and had been careful not to act on knowing without sufficient grounds, because you did not make a formal accusation against the Stonemark warrior before the Elder Council without grounds that could hold scrutiny from every angle. This would be examined. Every piece of it would be examined by people who were looking for weaknesses in the argument because they wanted a different outcome. She looked at Cillian across the table. He looked back at her. He did not say he had told her. He did not say anything about 14 months of waiting. He nodded once, simply. She thought about Aldrich Vane, about 3 years of deliberate, patient interference, about 2 men on a road in partial clan colors, and Wren sitting on her pack in the rain believing she had been discarded, about the weight her sister had been carrying in the part of herself she did not examine, the lie told to make the loss survivable, about what it would cost him when she returned to the stronghold with her sister alive and this folder in her hand. Everything, she thought, it would cost him everything. Before they left the settlement, Dara found Celeste Hahn working in the far yard with the focused efficiency of a woman who kept busy because that was how she was built. She said what needed to be said in the formal Stonemark Register of Significant Debt, which was the closest she could come in any available language to expressing what 3 years of care for her sister actually represented. Celeste looked at her with the direct, unhurried eyes of someone who had not done what she did in order to be thanked for it. She said that Wren had given as much as she had received, that the settlement was better for having had her in it, that she would be welcome to come back whenever she wanted to come, and that the door that had been open for 3 years was not going to close just because someone had finally come to collect her. Dara thanked her a second time, in plain English, because that felt more accurate. Celeste nodded once, the way practical people nod when a thing has been said and understood, and there is nothing further to add, and went back to her work. The right moment came that night. After the reunion and the long talking and the meals Celeste produced and the stories exchanged, and the quiet that settled over the house when everyone had finally reached the end of what needed to be said for now. Cillian was outside. She found him sitting on a low stone wall at the edge of the yard, looking at the sky. The clouds had cleared in the evening, and the stars were out in the extravagant way of the Tennessee Highlands on a cold, clear night, as though the sky had been saving them up and had decided tonight was the occasion to spend everything it had. She sat beside him, not at a distance, close. She was done with the performance of distance. She said without preamble, "I want to offer you something." He turned to look at her. She told him what the Stonemark clan owed him. She said it formally because the debt was real, and diminishing it by treating it casually would be a kind of dishonesty she was not willing to commit. 4 years of documentation that no official channel had produced. Shelter and legal protection on the night her guards had come to his door. The work that had led them here, to this yard, to her sister, standing alive in a doorway. The clan would grant him land and title in the Eastern Territory. A proper house, resources, recognition as a person of standing in a community that had been telling him he was a record keeper in a town that barely existed. She said it all precisely, as it deserved to be said. Then she stopped. He waited. The formal register left her voice the way weight leaves shoulders when you finally set down what you have been carrying. She said, "And I am asking you something apart from all of that, apart from the debt and the land and what the clan owes and what the politics require. I am asking you to stay near me, not as a recipient of what I can give, not as anything I can find the right title for." She paused. She said, "In our tradition, what I am describing is called a choosing. It means I have looked at everyone around me and I have chosen you. Not what you can do, not what you represent. You specifically. The person who kept looking when the world told him it was over. The person who sat up through my fever and made it feel like something shared rather than something endured. The person who stood between me and my own clan's guards with nothing but a knowledge of property law and did not waver. That person." The stars were very clear and very cold. He said, "I'm terrified." She said, "I know." He said, "I'm nobody. I rent a cottage with a leaking roof and I maintain other people's records and I don't have a lineage or a battle history or be." She said, "You are the person who kept looking for my sister when the world told him it was finished. You are the person who'd get up through my fever without once making me feel like an imposition. You are the person who stood between me and 3 of my own clan's warriors with nothing but a knowledge of property law and a voice that did not shake." He almost smiled at that last part. She said, "I am not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I am asking you to be exactly that, near me." He looked at the stars for a long moment. He said, "I don't want your land or your title." He said it without softening it. He said, "If I come because of you, not because of what you're going to be or what you can provide. Just you. That's the only reason I'm willing to cross that particular threshold." Something in her face changed. The readiness that was always present, the constant low-level preparation for whatever the next thing required, eased, not disappeared. It was built too deeply to disappear, and she had not been looking for someone to make it go away. But it eased in the way that a fist opens when the thing it was holding is finally, gently, set down. She said, "Then come just for me." He said yes. The word landed with the specific weight of something decided before it was spoken. She put her hand over his. Her hand was large compared to his, rougher, bearing the calluses of weapons training and hard travel and a decade of leadership. He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it. They sat on the wall under the cold Tennessee stars, and neither of them spoke for a long time. It was the best kind of silence, the kind that does not require anything of the people inside it. They returned to the Stonemark stronghold 11 days later. Marsh had sent a coded message ahead, and the Elder Council had used the time efficiently. By the time the procession came down the approach road, Dara and Wren side by side in front, Cillian slightly behind, the guards in proper formation. The welcome and the reckoning had been arranged into the same occasion, which was how significant matters tended to be handled in Stonemark governance. The council chamber smelled like old wood and lamp oil, and the particular weight of rooms where important decisions had been made for a very long time. The objections were not cruel. Elder Hannah had instructed her fellow council members that cruelty would serve nothing and would not be tolerated in the chamber, which meant that what reached Dara were the genuine concerns rather than the performative ones. The political calculations about precedent, the realistic assessment of which alliances would be strained, the specific vulnerabilities that a future clan leader's unusual choice of companion would create in negotiations with older, more traditional allied clans. She listened to all of it. She let them finish. Then she stood and said, with the measured control of someone trained since childhood for exactly this kind of room, Cillian Marks located and documented my sister's trail when every official channel had given up and closed the file. He provided shelter and protection to a member of this clan at personal risk, using the only tools available to him, which he used correctly. He acted with more consistent honor than most people born to it manage across an entire lifetime. She let that settle. Then, the Stonemark clan honors those who act with honor. That is not a recent addition to our code. It has been the foundation of who we are for 300 years. I am not asking you to change the law. I am asking you to follow it. Elder Hannah, who had been on the council since Dara's mother's time, and who had seen a great deal and was not easily moved, looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked across the chamber to where Cillian sat very still in a chair that had been built for a Stonemark warrior and had therefore absorbed him somewhat. A compact, ink-stained man in a large formal chair, watching Dara with the quality of attention he had given everything since the first night. Not performing confidence for the council's benefit, not concealing the fact that this was a large room full of large people, and he was a county records clerk from a town that barely appeared on maps. Just present, himself, steady in the specific way that did not require an audience. Hannah said slowly that she would not oppose it, that it was unorthodox, that there would be difficulties, that Dara had better be very certain. Dara said, I am certain. The formal challenge came from Aldrich Vane, but not in the form he had intended. He had planned to challenge Cillian's worthiness through the council's formal assessment process, a structured proceeding that required the challenged party to present their skills, their history, their value to the clan. It was calculated. A physical contest would have been refused, and Aldrich was not foolish enough to believe combat made his political point. The formal assessment was the arena where he expected a records clerk to fail, where the absence of lineage and battle honors would speak for themselves. He had not accounted for the folder. Cillian presented the documentation. He laid the case out with the precision of someone who had spent 4 years building it. Every sourced account in its proper relationship to every other, every cross-reference explained. Every distinction between what was confirmed and what was still inferred clearly marked. He presented it the way he had always presented things, clearly, without excess, trusting the people in the room to be capable of following the logic without being walked through it twice. Then he presented what the documentation said about Aldrich Vane, the postal receipt, the courier records connected to the associate, Wren's testimony about the third man at the interception, the scar, the jaw, the postural habit, the year 3 witness account that matched her description precisely. When he finished, the chamber was entirely quiet. Aldrich said, the girl was frightened and confused on that road. She misidentified a stranger. 4 years is a long time to hold on to a memory clearly. Wren, seated at the back of the chamber, looked at him. She said in a voice entirely calm, I saw his face clearly. The scar on his jaw left side beginning below the cheekbone and ending at the chin. His left shoulder carried higher than his right by approximately 2 inches. A healed break, improperly set. His weight distributed to the right when standing still. I saw all of this in good afternoon light at a distance of 30 feet. I have a clear memory, she paused. She said, I remember his face better than I remember most things from those years, because it was the face attached to the lie that my family had stopped looking for me. The chamber was very quiet. Aldrich made 2 more attempts to contest specific elements of the documentation. Elder Hannah allowed him to finish each time before calling the next point. His arguments were the arguments of a man who had prepared them for a proceeding he had expected to control, discovering that the proceeding had different information than he had anticipated. Hannah called the investigation. 3 weeks, conducted by a panel of 5 council members with no prior connection to either Aldrich Vane or the succession question. She called 3 of the names from Cillian's files, People he had contacted over 4 years who had documented small pieces of the pattern and placed them in the chamber one at a time and asked them to say what they knew. The pattern held from every direction. Aldrich Vane was removed from his warrior rank and stripped of his council standing. He was barred from clan governance for a period of not less than 10 years, pending full review of the investigation's findings, and the investigation was not yet finished. He left the chamber in the specific silence of a man who has run the calculation and found no better outcome available than the one being handed to him. After the chamber emptied, Elder Hana remained at the head of the council table for a long time. The lamp oil was getting low. The room had the particular feeling of a space where something significant had concluded. She looked at Dara. She said with the directness she reserved for things that mattered, "Your mother would have handled it exactly this way. The patience of it, the completeness of it. She would have waited until it was airtight, and then she would have laid it all on the table at once." Dara said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "She was better at the patience than I am." Hana said, "You were patient enough." After, in the corridor outside the chamber, Marsh walked beside Cillian for a moment without speaking. His expression was the expression of a man who had arrived at a conclusion over a period of weeks and had decided it did not require announcement. He said, "You did well in there." Cillian said, "I just showed them what was in the files." Marsh said, "That's what I mean." 6 months after the road south and the Sawyers and the low stone wall in Tennessee, the cottage in Harrow Creek had a new tenant. Cillian worked from a room in the Stonemark Stronghold's east wing, a proper room with shelves on 3 walls and light from 2 windows, which he had organized with the same careful economy he had applied to the rented cottage. Records and correspondence on the shelves, a cross-reference system that now served an entire clan's documentation needs rather than a single ongoing private investigation. A corner of the main shelf holding a small framed photograph of a young orc woman mid-laugh, positioned where he could see it from the desk. He had kept the photograph. It seemed important to keep it, not as a record or a trophy or evidence of anything, but because it was the thing he had looked at in the second year when he was deciding whether to continue, and he did not want to forget what continuing had looked like from the inside, what the argument for it had been. A girl in a photograph laughing at something off camera, and the certainty that somewhere someone who loved her was still looking, and that stopping was choosing to agree she did not matter. He was not willing to forget that. His work was in demand in a way that had taken him time to fully accept. A stronghold full of people who valued action and directness had, as it turned out, a century of documentation that had never been properly organized. 4 generations of land records stored in order of acquisition rather than by territory. Alliance correspondence that had never been indexed. Trade agreements existing in single copies, in single locations, with no backup system. The kind of archival fragility that made records keepers quietly anxious and should have made everyone else anxious too. He was not nothing here. He had needed time to believe that, and he still had days when the old smallness returned. Standing in a room full of people taller than him by significant margins, navigating the specific social architecture of a community with 300 years of history, he was still learning, feeling the distance between what he was and what surrounded him with particular acuteness. On those days she found him, not with speeches, not with reassurance structured to address his specific doubts. She was not built that way, and he had not wanted her to be. She found him and asked what he needed, and when he said he needed to sit with something for a while, she accepted that without argument and gave him the space and came back afterward. She stayed near. He had learned her customs imperfectly and with ongoing corrections from Wren, who had appointed herself his informal tutor with enormous enthusiasm and very little concern for his dignity in the process. He had learned the greeting forms, the honor gestures, the formal expression of significant gratitude specific to Stonemark tradition, which he had used once on Elder Hana in a corridor, deploying it with more precision than she had expected, and which had produced in her face the expression of someone who was moved and had no intention of admitting it. She had nodded at him afterward with the specific gravity she reserved for things she approved of, and said nothing, and that had been sufficient. He had learned which council members responded to directness and which preferred the slower approach. He had learned that Marsh's professional reserve contained underneath it a quality of genuine loyalty that extended, once earned, with very few conditions. He had learned the difference between the formal and informal registers of Stonemark's social interaction and which situations called for which, and that getting this wrong occasionally was apparently acceptable if you got it right on the important occasions. He had learned about the courtship gifts. Wren had sat him down in the kitchen 3 weeks after his arrival and asked him if he understood what Dara had been doing for the past several weeks. He had not understood. Wren explained. The dried herb bundle left on his desk in the first week, a traditional Stonemark gift meaning I see you clearly and I am paying attention. The handmade fire kit in the second week, meaning I want you to be warm and I am thinking about your comfort. The clan-marked traveling cloak in the third week, meaning I claim responsibility for your safety and I am not ashamed to say so. He had kept all three because he liked them. He went immediately to find Dara and told her she should have explained what she was doing. She told him with the composed expression of someone enormously pleased with a situation she had engineered that he had demonstrated good instincts by keeping all three gifts without prompting, since in Stonemark custom this indicated reciprocal interest. He said he had kept them because he liked them and hadn't known what they meant. She said that was even better, because it meant the interest was genuine rather than performed. He looked at her for a moment. He said, "You knew I'd keep them." She said, "I suspected." He said, "You were testing me." She said, "I was giving you the opportunity to show me something true without asking you a question, which is how we prefer to learn things in the Stonemark tradition. Questions can be answered strategically. Actions are harder to perform when you don't know you're being observed." He thought about this. He said, "That is either very wise or deeply manipulative." She said, "In our experience, they are not mutually exclusive." He laughed. She smiled. The full smile, the one that changed her face, the one she had given him rarely enough that he had come to understand it as something genuinely meant. And they stood in the corridor of the stronghold with the sound of clan business happening at a distance around them, and said nothing for a moment because nothing needed to be said. They argued sometimes. She was direct to the point of bluntness, and he was precise to the point of pedantry, and these two qualities produce friction in specific situations. But the arguments were honest ones. Not the kind where someone was really arguing about something else. Not the kind that left residue. Two people who had each had too much experience with things left unsaid, and had decided together that saying things was worth whatever discomfort it cost. He cooked. She ate everything he made with the wholehearted appreciation of someone who had spent years on the road and found domestic cooking a genuine revelation each time. Gradually, she had started joining him in the kitchen in the evenings, her teaching him the Stonemark traveling broth again, this time in a kitchen large enough that she did not demolish the shelving, both of them at the stove in the comfortable companionship of people who have chosen each other and no longer find the choosing remarkable because it has become ordinary in the best possible way. Wren came by most evenings. She had moved into the stronghold after a period of living between Harrow Creek and the Eastern Settlement, and she had, in the months since the reunion, become something neither of them had fully anticipated. Not just Dara's sister recovered, not just the subject of a 4-year search concluded, but a full person with her own strong opinions and her own sharp humor and her own life that had been built in the years away and that she carried back with her intact. She had opinions about Cillian's filing system. He had invited her to improve it if she felt strongly, and she had, and it was better, which he acknowledged. She had opinions about Dara's leadership style, delivered with the frank directness of someone who had spent enough years away from the position to see it clearly. Dara listened to most of them with more attention than she listened to her counsel, though she would not have said so. She still had the laugh, still found the thing other people missed. The stronghold had been a more serious place before she came back to it, and it had no intention of returning to that condition. On an evening 8 months after the road south, Dara came to find Cillian in his workroom. He was finishing a document by the last of the daylight. He had a habit of working later than he should, which had not changed with better conditions, and he heard her in the doorway and looked up. There was something in her face that was different from her ordinary expression, softer and more serious at the same time, the quality of someone who has been carrying something and has decided the time to set it down is now. He put the pen down. She crossed the room and sat in the chair across from his desk, the chair he had replaced in the second week with one correctly sized, a practical adjustment requiring no negotiation. She placed both hands on the desk, palms flat. The formal stone-marked gesture of an oath beginning. He was still. She said, I said a choosing before. I want to say more than that now. He waited. She said, in our tradition, a choosing becomes a bonding when both parties offer an oath. I offer mine now. She said the words in the formal ancient syllables of the Stonemark clan, the register that carried the weight of every generation that had used it before her. 300 years of people standing in rooms and saying the thing that mattered most with all the weight it deserved. Then she translated, carefully and precisely, for him. I see you, I claim you. I will stand between you and anything that wishes you harm, for as long as my strength holds. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the last of the evening light was leaving the sky over the stronghold's courtyard. A wind moved through the yard, carrying the smell of the forest at the edge of the stone-marked territory, pine and cold stone, and the particular clean smell of Appalachian autumn going toward winter. He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his shirt pocket and took out the small notebook. The one he had been carrying for years. Before Harrow Creek, before Wren's photograph, before any of this. The records keeper's habit, the belief that things worth thinking deserve to be written. He opened it to a blank page. He wrote something. It took him a moment because he wanted it to be accurate rather than impressive, which had always been his standard for the things that mattered. He turned the notebook to face her. She read it. It said, I have been looking for you since before I knew I was looking. I don't know your oaths, but I know this. Wherever you go, I go. Whatever you carry, I'll carry some of it, for as long as I'm standing. She looked at what he had written for a long moment, long enough that he had time to wonder if he had gotten it wrong, if the plainness of it was insufficient for what the moment required. She said, that is sufficient. He said, just sufficient? She looked up. The thing that was always present in her face, the readiness, the guard that had been built over 30 years of being the person who held things together, eased. It did not vanish. It was built too deeply into her to vanish, and she had not been looking for someone to take it away. But it eased in the specific way that things ease when you are finally, genuinely, not carrying them alone. She smiled at him, the full smile, the one that changed her face entirely, that she gave rarely enough that each time felt like something real rather than something offered. She said, it is more than sufficient. It is everything. He closed the notebook. He reached across the desk. She took his hand in both of hers, her hands large and warm and careful around his, and held it with the particular quality of someone who has spent a long time holding things alone and has decided that this is what it feels like not to. Wren appeared in the doorway approximately 4 seconds later. She took in the scene with the expression of someone who had been hoping for exactly this outcome and was experiencing the satisfaction of being right about something she had been right about for a considerable time. She announced, with the forthright efficiency she applied to most things, that she was making dinner and both of them were required to appear in the kitchen within 10 minutes, and she was not negotiating on the timeline, which shattered the solemnity entirely. Dara looked at the doorway. She looked back at him. He was already almost laughing. She said quietly, This is what I could not have imagined. He said, which part? She said, all of it, every ordinary impossible part of it. Outside, the last light was leaving the sky over the stone-marked stronghold, and the stars were coming out one by one over the Appalachian ridgeline, the same stars that had been over a low stone wall in Tennessee 8 months ago when the choice was made and said aloud for the first time. From the kitchen down the hall came the sound of Wren beginning dinner with the confidence and noise of someone who cooked the way she did everything, completely, with more sound than strictly required, and with that laugh underneath it all, finding the thing everyone else missed. They held on for one more moment in the quiet of the room. 2 hands across the width of a desk. The photograph on the corner of the shelf, the girl mid-laugh, kept because what it had meant to keep looking deserved to be remembered. Then they went. He had come to Harrow Creek 6 years ago with nothing he had not carried himself. He had left it with even less by material measure. The lease surrendered, 2 bags packed. Goodbye to his friend in the village, who had told him not to be an idiot and to come back if he needed to, said in the particular tone of someone who knew he would not need to. He had taken the photograph off the wall, the last thing he removed, the pin pulled carefully, The frame held steady. He carried it still. She had come to his house in the dark to take back what belonged to her sister. She had taken more than she came for. She had given more than she had planned. She had stopped pretending either of those things was a surprise a long time ago. Somewhere around the fourth day, probably, when the card game had produced a laugh she had not heard from herself in years, and she had recognized what was happening and had not stopped it. They had cost each other nothing and given each other everything. That was not how the accounting was supposed to work. They had both lived long enough and through enough to know that the accounting almost never worked that way. Almost never was not never. They were the proof of it. Two worlds and one choice made over and over in the small, ordinary daily moments. The soup pot and the ink-stained desk and the stars from a low wall and the card game and the hand held across every difference of size and history and 300 years of distance between where they each came from. One choice made over and over. It was enough. It was everything.